We are live.
We're live. It's Senate Appropriations Committee. It's March 18th. We're going through FY26 budget requests as we build the budget. And now we're going to be talking to the State Board of Education in their budget. And we have the executive director and the board chair. We have the chair and the vice chair. Because there isn't any staff of the board. No. Right. So I'll let you introduce yourselves. You're both on mute, but you can introduce yourselves, and we can introduce ourselves. New to the committee. You go ahead.
Well, thank you, everyone. Just for the record, I'm Jennifer Deck Samuelson. I'm the chair of the State Board of Education, and I'm joined here today by the board's vice chair, Tammy Colby. But thank you all very much for inviting us in.
Great. Nice to see you, Tammy. So we'll start over here. Normally, the Pro Tem Senator Bruce from Chittenden County would be here. He might walk in. And then here we have
Pat Brennan, Senator from Grand Isle County in Colchester.
And then Senator Lyons will probably walk in from Chittenden County, and Andrew Persick from the Washington District.
I'm Rich Westman from the Lamoille District.
Bob Norris, Franklin County, and the town of Elbert in Grand Isle County.
Ann Watson for the Washington District.
So we'll let you just walk through your presentation. I assume you sent us a presentation of sorts.
Well, yeah, so you guys have two documents. One is a memo that's dated February 14th, 2025 that was sent to the chairs of the House and Senate Education Committees. And then the other thing, and this is a late entry, and I apologize for not thinking of this sooner. There's another document that's entitled Summary of State Board of Education Responsibilities Articulated in Section 164, Status and Resources Needed for FY25. So I will be honest, this is not a clear ask. There are two different documents. I think the universe of what we're asking for makes sense, but it's not like those two documents necessarily dovetail. And I would say that the reason why it's not a clear ask is because it's not clear to the board what our responsibilities are. I just want to, name that for what it is and just, acknowledge the fact that we are in a state of flux. I think for years, the board has not been funded appropriately to allow it to do the work that is set forth in statute. So that's, primarily the 16 VSA section 164. And as you go through that document, there are, we try to highlight what the responsibility is in statute, whether we are meeting that responsibility under our current budget, and if we are not meeting it, what our best estimate would be to be able to meet that duty. And just as a reminder, the board has been level funded, I believe, since FY21. We currently, our budget is capped at $70,708 or $780. I think $70,780. So clearly not enough for us to do everything that is being requested of us in statute. The other thing, and I'll just turn now to the February 14th memo. That memo was prepared under the assumption that the board is continuing with with the current list of responsibilities that have been assigned to it. That may change. That may change this legislative session. And I think the important thing to note there is that if the board's duties expand or are shrunk or are modified, it would be really, really important to make sure that we are given the appropriate support that would allow us to accomplish whatever responsibilities are assigned to us. I think board members are definitely interested in doing the work, but we really need the resources to be able to do it. So the February 14th memo is really a pared down version of what the board felt was critical to its ability to survive in FY26, given the current state of what is in statute for us to be doing and what we felt was reasonable. And so that really breaks down into For considerations, we need legal support. The board used to rely on the Agency of Education for legal support. That practice has been discontinued, which has left the board without legal counsel.
So AOE just tells you, sorry, there are no lawyers. Is that basically, they're just saying we're not gonna do that anymore?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm a lawyer in my day job, and I understand where the agency is coming from. We are two different organizations that may not have perfect alignment of interest. And so I think best practice is that the agency's attorney represents the agency, but that leaves the board without an attorney. And I think the process for us now is if we need an attorney, we have to put it out to bid. We have to, have a job description, and the attorney is confined to that job description. And, my experience has been that it takes from the time that we identify a need for an attorney until the time we actually have someone that is able to help us is a good 3 months. And that attorney is only able to help us, for things that fall within that scope of the contract. So if there's another issue that comes up, we still don't have an attorney. And we
Jennifer,
feel
it might be helpful to help the committee understand some of the reasons we need need legal counsel. I'm not sure. Obviously, rulemaking is one of them, but we have other responsibilities in statute. Maybe it would be helpful to sort of help the committee understand, like, why do we need legal counsel, and why would it be important to have independent legal counsel?
Sure. So increasingly, the board's responsibilities have really focused on issues of statutory construction. So, Tammy's right. We do, certainly in the last few years, the bulk of our work has been engaged in rulemaking, and it has been critical for us to have an attorney to be able to help us with that. We also, by statute, entertain certain appeals. We sit in a quasi-judicial capacity. So we've had like tuition rate appeals. We've had appeals from people who want to be able to send their child to a certain school. There are, and I know that there are a lot of sort of percolating in the background, maybe districts want to withdraw from, a school district might want to withdraw from its supervisory district or supervisory union. We've had those issues come up, and we don't have an attorney who can really help us look at what statute requires, what the process would be, and to help the board through that.
And this was an issue back when I was on the education committee years ago, so I think it's an ongoing problem. And did you get I see in this memo about the budget adjustment, $18,000. That never happened, right? Yeah.
No, and we're in a,
So we're at this point, we're in the red and having to carry over into next year now expenditures we anticipated having, things for which we needed to make expenditures this year because we didn't get the budget adjustment, and those expenditures are directly related to rulemaking that we already completed.
Well, and we didn't get the budget adjustment for this year that would allow us to engage in rulemaking for updating the career and technical education rules. So at this point, I think the board has a little bit, like I want to say around $35,000 left in its budget, which sounds like a lot if we back burner everything. It actually doesn't provide enough money for us to do anything substantive, such as update a rule series. We currently have education standards that have been proposed to the board, and that authority arises under 16 VSA 164.9, where the board is in charge of evaluating education standards. You guys might be familiar with Common Core. Last fall, the board also approved updates to the National Health and Physical Education Standards. We have another set of standards that's been proposed to us by the Act One working group. And unlike other standards that the board has considered, these are not national standards that are being brought to Vermont. These are sort of new standards that are being proposed in the first instance. Again, the board feels it would be really helpful to have a consultant help us with that work, but we don't have money in the budget to hire a consultant, so that work is also on pause.
Okay, yeah, when did that, so have you had the Act One recommendations for a while, or?
They were first brought to the board, I want to say, in the summer of 2023. And at that point, the board was engaged in updating our education quality standards, which are Rule Series 2000. It was important from a linear point of view to complete the education quality standard rules in Rule Series 2000 first, so that we can figure out how the proposed education standards that are coming up pursuant to 164.9 would slot into that. So although it's been almost 2 years since they were first brought before the board was not really in a position to take on that work until this past fall.
Okay. Yeah, I was on education when we did that. Senator Lyons has a question.
Sure. Remind me, thank you for being here today. This is really helpful. And the table that you provided with your role and responsibilities is really very helpful. I don't know that I've ever seen it articulated this way. You've got it articulated very well. Remind us how you are appointed. What's the appointment process? Is there a nominating committee? Do you get interviewed and then name sent to the governor, or how does that happen? I know we go through the approval process in our education committee in the Senate.
So we are all appointed by the governor, and Senator Lyons, I think I do remember meeting with you after I had been appointed to the State Board of Ed, because I went before the Senate Education Committee. So that is sort of the culmination of an appointment, is to meet with the Senate Education Committee and be confirmed. But we are appointed by the governor. I do know that there are applications that are out there for interested members of the public to submit in order to express their interest. But ultimately, the decision is made by the governor's office.
Yeah. I mean, as a board, have you talked about what would make a more robust board? It's always frustrating to me that the board feels like they're, I won't say shorthanded, but understaffed, under-resourced in some ways. Has the board had that conversation recently? I see yes. I mean, you don't have to say that you have a recommendation or anything, but for me, if I think about the boards that we have in the state, for example, the Public Utility Commission, or the used to be Natural Resources Board, Land Use Board, and the Green Mountain Care Board, and they all have really exceptional responsibilities similar to what you have, albeit different. And you are working at a shoestring compared to what they're working with. My comment.
I would agree with that.
If I may.
Yeah, you've got a lot of responsibilities.
One of the core, right, in 2012, there was sort of this bifurcation, right, between the agency and the board, and the relationship between the agency and the board shifted. Prior to that, right, the agency of education, the Department of Education, it reported to the board. And when that split occurred, what really sort of the board's role is really sort of a regulatory board. And our core function are the rules that govern education in Vermont, right? And that's public education, independent schools, special education. And those rules are the things that school boards, superintendents, principals, and teachers go to, right, when they figure out how to interpret statute and do what it is we see on a day-to-day basis as education in this state. The board takes that role very seriously. We updated the education quality standards. That was a multi-year process. That is one of the strongest and most progressive sets of education quality standards in the country right now. We're very proud of that, and Vermont should feel very good about that. We also have a lot of other rules who we have not been able to touch. Some of them are out of date by 20 years. They predate this split. And you'll see in our budget request, one of the things we really want to do is get to our core function, which is we need to go back and examine that canon of rules, modernize them. Some of those rules we don't need anymore. Some of those things would be better placed as standard operating procedures within the agency. And we need to really, but we need to look at that canon and modernize that. We've got rules that aren't even in sync with current statute right now. And part of what we've been limited in our ability to do that for many of the reasons you just cited, which is we're just under-resourced, right? We don't have counsel. It's just really hard. It's been really hard for the board to do that work, and it's really important work. But I will say that the work we have done, I think stands on its own merit. The EQS is excellent. I mean, it's a good rule. There's no such thing as a perfect rule, but it's a really good rule. Our independent schools approval rules are good. Like, we've done some really, really good work here in the last few years on the rules, and I think we'd really like to be looking forward to developing a really coherent regulatory framework in the state, not this hodgepodge outdated framework that we have right now. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question, Senator Lenz. I think it's just important to sort of step back and realize that, what is the board's role right now after that split in 2012? And that is really, we are very much the regulatory board for education, not just public education, but also independent schools.
No, thank you. You have responded, and one of the things that we heard last session from the Natural Resources Board was that they needed some resources to update their rules and to bring them up into 21st century. And now you're in a position where things are changing radically, and we're going to see we'll see huge change. Well, I guess the question is, if you were going to set a priority, would you set a priority to do rulemaking right now or something else? And if you are going to do rulemaking, it would seem to me you need some external support, whether you have people helping you do it or there are resources to make it happen. That's a lot of work.
Senator Lyons, many of you know that when I'm not wearing my State Board of Education hat, I do education policy work, and I spend a lot of time in the recent months doing work at the federal level and have been very much in the middle of all of that. And what I can say with one foot in both of those camps is that if the trajectory I think we're on comes to fruition, we are going to, as a state, have to be taking a very careful look at our rules. Right. It likely is the case that some of the federal sort of scaffolding that we use as sort of backdrop for our rules may no longer apply. And so as a state, we're going to have to make a decision about what it is we're going to do on our own and how that fits within what is probably going to be a reconceptualized overall federal policy framework. That creates a new set of urgency, I think, for the state board to be prepared to catch when that is thrown. I think we already had an urgency with the fact that many of our rules are so outdated, and that presents problems to the field. For example, in adult education, we have inconsistencies around what graduation requirements look like right now. And that's a problem in the field. I mean, we already have those kinds of urgency, but I think we just put an exponent behind that with respect to what is going to likely be a very significantly deregulated federal structure that then shifts that responsibility out to the states and makes it up to states to come up with their own frameworks without having sort of that previously held federal sort of framework and statutory construction behind it. So we likely are going to have a lot more work to do coming up. And it's going to be really important work if we want to preserve the values that we have here in Vermont for our education and for our students.
And let me just add to that too, because I do realize that there is some consideration about, whether it should be the State Board of Education that retains rulemaking authority or whether that responsibility should be shifted to the agency. Honestly, if the rulemaking authority is shifted to the agency, our line item request for a one-time appropriation wouldn't need to be granted. But what I will say is I think that the board feels very strongly that we do add value to the rulemaking process by being the entity that is in charge, not for all rules. And as Tammy said, there are some rules that don't need to be rules. They could be standard operating procedures. There are also, some rules that could be shifted to the agency because that would probably make sense. But kind of the overarching rules about what does education in Vermont look like from, pre-K through, post-secondary. I think there's an argument there for retaining, keeping that authority with the State Board of Education for a couple of reasons. One, we stand outside of that process, and we are, I take very seriously the fact that the State Board of Education is a neutral, independent body. To me, that is of value because we exist independent of what else is going on around us. And I think too, our track record of how we have approached rulemaking is really helpful to the field, where what we have done is before we even officially open a rule for public rulemaking, the APA rulemaking process, is we do a lot of pre-work. Where, for instance, when Tammy was in charge of the education quality standards updates, she and then co-chair Kim Gleason invited in a series of practitioners in the field from all different aspects and asked if the rules were implementable. It had a series of questions and really put a lot of front work in a public meeting to preparing those rules before we even got to the APA rulemaking process. So our rulemaking is done, because it has to be in a warned public meeting that's open.
So, I mean, as you're speaking, I go back to my original comment about the different boards that we have, and the regulatory boards that we have are pretty well defined as quasi-judicial and have some legal authority within the system, also developing rules, whereas the administration that works adjacent to those boards has more of a role in implementing activities, actions, and policies. So, yeah, and I know there's always been this division about whether it's the board or the agency that gets to write rules. I'm leaning very much in the direction of the board having that authority to make it more consistent with what we see with our other boards. So, but thank you for your thoughts on this.
So I think, the bottom line here is that the responsibilities of the State Board of Ed are definitely in a state of flux. We will do whatever is asked of us. I think, and that is the one thing. I mean, I often say that we have a variety of backgrounds and perspectives on the board, but the uniting thread is that we all care deeply about the work that we're doing. So however things resolve in terms of the responsibilities that are handed to the State Board of Education, I think you all can know that we will do that work. My request is that as you are considering what that work looks like, that you make sure that we are appropriately resourced, because I think we have done an admirable job for over a decade to do the work that's been done. But I think it's probably clear to everybody that there are gaps that have just emerged because we don't have the resources to do everything that's been given to us in statute.
Thank you.
Which I think is what I heard in education when Chair Baruch was in education. We talked about the board that under-resourced, and it's confusing about which roles it's doing versus AOE. And I think that year we made some changes, or we tried to make changes. I don't know if that bill ever passed. So I assume that's still an issue about like which rules the board should do and which rules the agency should do.
That has not been resolved.
Okay.
And Senator Perch, like to that point, in our proposal for additional resources around sort of modernizing the corpus of the rules would be a systematic process that we work through with the agency to actually do that. That would be the first step in that process, right? Is to look at the rules that we have and really think about which of these rules really need to be rules. There are things in regulation that need in regulation right now, right? Like, and that's burdensome and it makes the agency's job difficult. And we should sunset those rules and hand that discretion back to the agency. Certainly the education quality standards, the independent school approval rules, the CTE rules, and the special education rules, those 4 rules need to stay together because if you make adjustment, well, we never want a situation, for example, CTE and EQS, we don't want a situation where a child walks across the hallway and they have 2 different sets of protections. Like that could happen, right? Same thing with special education, and we certainly want to make sure that our students who attend independent schools have the same opportunities to learn as our children who attend public schools and vice versa. So I think to that point, when we start to talk about like reimagining the rules, I think the first thing we need to do is get a coherent policy framework around the rules. What should be in regulation, what should not be, what should be, where the agency should have more flexibility on those. And then what I think the hope would be is we can really start to focus on these really core rules and make sure that we have that the rules are consistent with statute.
Sounds great. And so the work would result in recommendations to the legislature clarifying that.
And I think that's an important point, right? As a part of that process, certainly we're going to be looking at statute to align the rules with statute, but we already know, right, from the work we've done, there are some places where statute is not as clear as it might need to be to help do some of this alignment and where we have some friction. And we can certainly, as a part of that process, identify places where we need to true things up, right, across statute and between the statute and the rules.
Right. Senator North.
Yes, when you keep talking about depending on what your responsibilities are going to be, I'm assuming you're reacting to the letter that was sent from the school construction board, this summer study committee that got sent back to the Committee of Jurisdictions in reference to education. As far as I believe it came out as the board would be quite possibly an advisory group and not part of the rulemaking procedures in the future. Don't quote me on that. But if in fact that's the case, and you are talking about a particular line item here that you may not need, which one are we looking at here? Which line item will we be looking at?
Well, and thank you for asking that question, because I realize I wasn't maybe as clear as I meant to be. I believe Tammy and I were called in to testify in November about school construction. And I do recall seeing that we would be put on like an advisory role. But really the legislation that I'm referring to is, specifically, I think it's H454, the governor's bill that has been, proposed by the Secretary of Education that really does strip the board's powers and shift a lot of what we are currently responsible for to the agency. That was really what I was getting at. I mean, if you look at that proposal, there's not a whole lot in statute that would remain under the board's authority. So I just want to acknowledge that's an inflection point. It's not for the board to make that decision. The General Assembly is going to have to figure out what the board is responsible for. I'm just saying, if we do remain responsible for rulemaking, we have our appropriation request. And if other things are added to the board's list of responsibilities to maybe supplant the rulemaking authority, I just want it to be the case that we would be resourced to do whatever it is that we're being asked to do.
And I'll just add to that, the board had a considerable discussion of the governor's proposal, in particular the shift in rulemaking authority. And part of that discussion, now the agency secretary was part of that discussion. And if you'd like to, the board is, Chair Samuelson mentioned, came out quite strongly opposed to the idea of the rules being moved. But I would point the committee to that discussion. I believe the video is available online. I think that sort of get a better sense of the board's position, and you can also understand sort of some of the concerns that were raised, and there were some fairly significant concerns that were raised in that discussion. So I would point you to that discussion, which is available from one of our, we had a special meeting just to have that conversation. And again, we invited the agency to be part of that.
Okay, Senator Watson.
Yeah, thank you. This may be more of a question for the chair, but it's about this process. Because I'm hearing you about the need to, I guess, make some decisions about the direction we're going, where we have clarity about what the appropriation ask is. And so it's feeling like a little bit of an order of operations kind of problem, like what needs to go first. And so, I mean, usually the budget is the last thing to go. And so that I guess I'm just wanting to confirm that that is still the plan. I know education is the topic for the session, and so I know there's going to be a lot more discussion around that. But even so, we're anticipating that the budget will be last.
Yeah, always the last train out.
Oh,
Okay, and so
There is, it could be like held up with the train, that is the education,
Right.
change, so that they have to go together,
Yeah.
sort of, because if one doesn't pass, then it changes, affects the other kind of thing, so.
no, that makes sense. Yeah, fair enough.
So
Thank you.
our request reflects the status quo, right?
Yeah.
So if there were no changes made to the State Board of Education's responsibilities, particularly with respect to the fact that we still hold the rules, then our request reflects that. And that additional request that you see for funding to modernize the rules certainly reflects that. Right. I do not know, and I haven't, let me rephrase that. I have not seen an additional request from the agency and the agency's budget to modernize the rules. So I don't know what their plans would be if in fact they intend to take over the rules. That is not a line item in their budget at this point, which frankly raises some questions for me about what the plans are. But the fact is we have rules that are 20 years out of date. We need to update those rules because the field needs us to update those rules. We also have some significant pressures headed our way from the federal government that are going to require those rules to be carefully reconsidered.
Okay. Sheriff Samuelson, did you have another comment?
Oh, well, I was going to say, as the legislative session continues, and there's more shape maybe that's put on what the role of the board is going to be going forward, we would be happy to come back in and have, a more pointed conversation about, given a certain set of responsibilities, this would be our specific budget request, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think if the education reform train, if we want to call it that, gets much more clarity on what cars are on the train and where it's going, then we could maybe check back in with you and say, given this bill, how does the board look at that? Senator Lyons,
yeah, no, just going back, just generally thinking about our quasi-judicial boards overall and your role in regulation and the work that we've been doing with our Green Mountain Care Board in particular, regardless of what is in the bill and the legislation that comes forward, it seems to me you have some idea of what the role of the board should be. And that would be helpful for us to know, rather than waiting to say, well, the agency wants to do this and legislators want to do that. It would be really important to me to understand, A, your thoughts on the nominating process, the appointment process, and then whether or not the regulatory role that you play, your relationship with rules and rulemaking, and are you or should you ever be a quasi-judicial board? So there are some very overarching policy issues that you're very much embedded in that would help me. It's not something we can do in this room. We're just the Appropriations Committee. We're not the Education Committee. So anyway, that's an ask, really, your thoughts on that. I know you don't have any time to do it, but would appreciate a sketch.
Sure.
We did have a special meeting that addressed some of those issues, and I know Chair Samuelson had pulled together some bullet points on some of our board's reflections on that. I think that's something we certainly can summarize and get back to the committee.
Yeah, and after, well, the reason we held that special meeting was because Tammy and I were invited to go speak to House Ed with the board's response to the governor's education transformation proposal. And the board had not yet had that conversation. So, it required us to have a special meeting. And I prepared a slide presentation that I then, shared with House Ed, and I'm happy to share that. I can send that to Elle after we meet with you today. If you guys would like to take a look at it.
Yeah.
If that'd be helpful.
Yeah, please do.
Sure.
Any other questions? All right, well, thanks for your time, Chair Samuelson. Tammy, see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time and all your service. We appreciate it.
Thanks.
Likewise.
Bye.
We'll be in touch. Is DPS here?
Tricia is online, but Jennifer's also gonna be online and the deputy commissioner is gonna be online, and they are not yet. And
Okay.
Rich Hollenbach might be in the hallway, he's gonna
He
do
is,
the
that's true.
presentation.